as we find out, we find out more paradigms, more ways to collect evidence, to do field research, then of course we add to the literature. And that's why evidence-informed seems like a better choice here. But
Yeah.
when you think about it, that means when we look back and realize that we've been learning forever as human beings, from different eras, has it really changed when we compare what we're doing today in terms of learning as students and teachers and what people used to do in ancient Greece, for example? Or is it really completely
Such a
different?
great question. Yeah,
Right?
yeah, such a great question. All right, I'm
Yeah,
gonna pass over to you now. I'll come back at the end for questions. Enjoy your time
perfect.
with Andre, everyone.
Thank you so much, Felisa. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for bearing here with me, because I have no idea what happened to my computer, but I'm back and I'm safe and sound. Yeah. And so I can see that you've been answering these questions here. And I really want you to relax a little bit, try to find that in your cortex, It's there recorded somewhere in your brain as long-term memory. What do you think learning is like nowadays? Is it really different from what we used to have, I don't know, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, or even, let's say, thousands of years ago? Why is that an important question? Because if learning has changed, that means that maybe we have to change teaching accordingly, right? I'm going to start sharing my slide here so we can pick up from where Melissa stopped. And I have an argument coming from different authors, all science of learning authors, that might confuse you, but if you allow me just a couple of minutes, I will make sure that everything is clear. Because, well, if you think about ancient Greece, there was a lot of exploratory learning. People were out in nature. They were talking. I think Socrates comes to mind, right? Dialogues and asking questions, the Socratic method. But then when you go to medieval England, depending on which class you belong to, there was a lot of physical punishment. You had to memorize things that were absolutely not relevant to your life. If you were a noble person, then you would probably have a private tutor or more. And still there was physical punishment. It was about obedience, not so much about exploration. And then if you go to rural India in the 90s, and I picked this example because there is a professor from Newcastle University. You may have heard his name, Sugata Mitra, right? And he did a very interesting experiment in India that he called the hole in the wall. And it's interesting because he put a computer connected to the internet in a wall in rural India. And then he just, it left students and people, kids who were living in that location just to explore and try to do something. And guess what? They learned. There was no tutor. There was nothing. There was just a computer connected to the internet and kids learned, right? So the question here is, are we learning the same exact way today as we did before? Probably yes. If you look at the research that was conducted by this amazing neuroscientist educator, a friend, I can call him, Dr. Jared Cooney Horvath, he says that, yes, every human being learns the exact same way. So if that is true, why has teaching changed over the years? Is it because we're getting better at teaching, or because we're using evidence to make teaching more aligned with learning? What is happening, right? But then when you look at other researchers, other people who work with the science of learning, they will say that, well, maybe Jared is not right. As a matter of fact, Todd Rose, who was the former head of mind-brain education program at Harvard, said something. This was during his TED talk. If every pilot has a jagged size profile and you design a cockpit on average, you've literally designed it for nobody. So he's talking about pilots, he's talking about fighter jets, and he's talking about how you have to make sure that you can accommodate anyone who's going to fly that thing, no matter what body type they have. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Okay, so we have a problem here. One neuroscientist tells us that we learn the exact same way. The other tells us that we have to adapt according to different body sizes, and that applies here. We're talking about teaching and learning. So everybody has a different way of learning, perhaps, and then we have to adapt to that. Who's right? Are they both right? Actually, they are. It depends on your level of analysis. Now, what do I mean by that? If we look at another researcher from this area, so we're talking about the science of learning, but we're also talking about an area that is called the mind-brain education area. And it's a very interesting science that all of you here should know more about. Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa says that human brains are as unique as faces. So that means that our genome, our experiences, nurture, nature, right? They play a role here. And we are very different. We are individually different. Of course we are. But there are certain elements of learning, certain aspects of learning that are universal, that they don't change really, because that's what we need for learning to happen. And here I'm talking about cognitive, but not just the cognitive, also an emotional and motivational perspective. There are certain cognitive processes that need to take place for us to learn. If we don't know about those cognitive processes, we don't learn. Actually, if we don't perform or if they don't happen in our brain, we don't learn. And when we learn about those cognitive processes as educators, as English teachers or language teachers, can we make better decisions about how we can design our lessons and teach our students? What do you think? Yes or no? So you can enter your answers there in the chat. Yes, I see a lot of yeses. That's good. That's excellent, right? So what are those things that are universal? What are those things that are not universal, that really vary according to the individual? And what can they tell us about how we plan and deliver our lessons? Are you ready for this? Okay, so pay attention. Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa designed this very interesting way of looking at all of those things. And then she called them principles, tenets, and instructional guidelines, okay? So I really want you to help me out here. What comes to your mind when you think of principles and then tenets and then instructional guidelines? I've given you a tip already. So what are principles? I can see people coming from all over the world. This is exciting. And I'm glad you waited for me because of, the glitch that I had to face here. So what are the principles? What are tenets? And what are instructional guidelines? So let me help you out here. What do you think are universal aspects of learning? Principles, tenets, or instructional guidelines? Okay. Now, what do you think are, let's say, aspects of learning that vary according to the individual? Okay. All right, tenets, all right. And what do you think are, let's say, ideas or structures or even frameworks that can help us teach so that students can learn better based on those universal things and those individual things? Yes, instructional guidelines, 3. So I can see there that everybody's on the same page. That's amazing. And that's exactly right. According to Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa, principles are universal learning principles that apply to every brain. That means that if we do not respect those principles, our students are not going to learn. As simple as that. And I'll give you one example here. Everyone here, all of you included, you need to pay attention to learn. Without attention, there is no learning. Attention is a cognitive process, right? Does that make sense to you? Do you agree? Yeah? Because when you pay attention, you decide, and sometimes it's not voluntary, to be honest, but well, let's say if you play conscious effort or attention here, that means that you decide to allocate focus or this cognitive resource here so that you can start learning from this person, learning from this stimulus, right? So you say, I want to learn from this. I will pay attention. I will start listening. I will start looking at this, and then I'll learn, right? The problem is at any moment you can stop paying attention because something else popped up in your brain, because there was a distractor in the environment, because it was too hard and you couldn't cope with all that information. So you stop paying attention. The moment you stop paying attention, you stop learning because nothing is getting into your working memory, right? So attention is a very, very expensive commodity, let's say, because it's essential for learning. And all of you teachers all over the world, do you agree or disagree? Are students paying more or less attention nowadays? Is it easier or is it harder to grab your students' attention? Yeah, I think everybody's is on the same page here. It's harder to get students' attention. And there's a reason why. It's because we live in an era of distractions. Everything is trying to steal our attention. We have algorithms, we have screens, we have everything. Our environments, our contexts are full of distractors. So it's very hard to compete. And if you have your attention fragmented, divided, that means you're not learning very well. So that's a universal principle. However, what makes little John pay attention is very different from what makes little Mary want to pay attention, because they have different interests, right? They have different types of, let's say, curiosity or levels of motivation, depending on what they're learning. So for John, it's easy to pay attention here because he really likes this. This is interesting. It's curious. But for Mary, no, it's not. But then you change the topic, you change the lesson, then Mary wants to pay attention. John doesn't want to pay attention, right? So we're dealing with a lot of students. Some of us are teaching 30, 40, 50 students in the class. And then, of course, it's very hard to get everyone to pay attention at the same time because they have different interests. But everyone needs to pay attention because that's a universal principle of learning, right? And what about instructional guidelines? Well, if I know that attention is essential and that all of my students will pay attention at different times based on their interest, on their degree of motivation, I have to come up with a plan to design my lesson, to make sure that everyone is paying attention. I could start with something that is irresistible, let's say, that will make everyone pay attention. I could start with a thought-provoking question, or a bizarre image, or a quiz, or a game, because usually those things are irresistible. We want to solve enigmas. So if I show a bizarre picture of something that doesn't make sense, suddenly everybody goes like, oh, what is that? I want to know what that is. I want to make sense of that. And that makes everyone pay attention. If you start with a thought-provoking question that is interesting, is curious, everyone wants to pay attention because they want to solve the enigma, right? If you start with a quiz to activate their prior knowledge, everyone wants to pay attention, right? So we have to spend more time trying to get our students to pay attention. Otherwise, we cannot put anything inside their working memory. If there's nothing there, they won't learn, right? Now, how can we do that? Well, we can do that by looking at the science of learning. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to read this, and then I'm going to ask you a question, okay? So this is a definition here that I got from a very important institution. So there you go. Read it, and then I'll ask you a question. Okay. Yeah, I think you had enough time to read that, right? So I'm going to show you the 3 or 4 different areas that are very important for the science of learning. And then I have a question for you. So I want to see if you were paying attention, all right? First area that is really important here for the science of learning, to exist is neuroscience and biology, of course. We have to understand from a brain's perspective, and here I can stop sharing my screen just a little bit because I want to show you my friend, the brain. See, this is the brain. And we have to understand, we have to learn a little bit more about neuroscience, especially the universal principles that will help us design better lessons that work, right? That's key. Now, but also, as somebody mentioned just now here in the chat, we also have to learn a little bit about psychology and cognitive science, right? So when we learn about psychology and cognitive science, that means we understand students from an individual perspective, because brain science, neuroscience is done in a lab. We use neuroimaging studies, like PET scans, computerized tomographies and things like that. Of course, that doesn't have a direct translation to what we're doing in the classroom. So we have to look at psychology as well, because psychology will study the individual, their behavior, their emotional states and all of that. And also social psychology, how they interact in groups and all of that. But here's an area that has been quite important lately for the science of learning: computer science and engineering, especially algorithms, machine learning, artificial intelligence even. Those, they provide a lot of data for researchers to make inferences, to understand how we learn, how anything learns, even machines, right? So we are the perfect machine. Actually, we're not a machine. We are an organic machine, let's say. And our brain is better than most artificial intelligence. I will tell you that. Maybe you think, no, that's impossible. Artificial intelligence knows all the answers, but it doesn't work like that. It only knows a lot of answers by predicting how to combine words and after doing a lot of training with big data, right? So studying model, we can make inferences based on virtually nothing. Our genetic memory, our brain rocks, really. It's better than artificial intelligence, yeah? But here's the question I was going to ask you. Are you ready? This is an amazing question, very thought-provoking question. I want to see who's going to get it right. Are you ready? Yes. So, based on that slide, the one I just showed you, where did I get the pictures from? What was the source of my image? Does anybody know? Very good. Ah, wow. A lot of people were paying attention, actually. I thought most of you wouldn't pay attention to that, but you did. But here's the thing. What was written on the bottom left side of my slide? Can you remember that? Bottom left. Some people do remember. Look at that, right? I think Reese Puglisi was the one. Yeah, Sarah Jane. Some people do remember. A lot of people might not remember. And this is just how the brain works, You can remember certain things, other things you can't remember. For example, I am almost certain you cannot remember the full name of the 3 researchers I mentioned. There were 2 quotes by 2 researchers. You cannot remember their full names. And then there was a diagram from another researcher, right? You might remember their last name or their first name, but not their full names, right? Ah, you wrote them down. Okay, so you're not using your memory. You're using an aid, okay? Why am I doing this to you? This is meant to show you that our memory is not perfect, right? We cannot possibly remember everything we're exposed to, especially when on purpose, and I did this on purpose, I did not direct your attention to that. Now, here's the question. If I had asked you before showing you the names of all the researchers, if I had asked you to pay attention to their names because I was going to ask you something later, would you be able to remember better? If I had said something, okay, pay attention, their names are very important. Yes, so we have this power as educators, as teachers. We can direct our students' attention. We can activate their feeling of alertness, you know. So how many times do you say in your class, in during your lessons, hey, pay attention, this is going to be very important, I'm going to ask you a question later? That helps them internalize that information. So we have to remember that we have the power to direct our students' attention because we can control what they see, what they don't see. However, even when we do that, some of them will not remember because that's a tenet, right? Because they will not be paying attention. They will be interested in something else. They will be distracted. So we have to do it again and again and again. Yes, right? And going back here to this slide, what does that tell us from a science of learning perspective? And now we're moving on to, the end of the session. So I can talk about the framework, some frameworks or some ideas that might help you. And then we can talk about 4 specific strategies based on the science of learning, right? So this is a framework that was developed by one of my best professors, an amazing teacher. His name is Paul Howard Jones, and collaborators, colleagues from the University of Bristol, where I studied. And this is very interesting, very intuitive, because it makes neuroscientific sense, right? He said that the very first thing we have to do to make sure that our students are paying attention, because without attention, there's no memory. Without memory, there's no learning, is to engage our students. And there are different ways we can engage our students. I'm going to ask you that in a second. After you engage your students' attention, you have their attention, that's when you start building new knowledge. Again, there's neuroscientific evidence, and not just neuroscientific, psychological evidence, right? The science of learning looks at all those areas, right? To make this appropriate, to understand why this works, right? Once they're building new knowledge, our working memory is very low in terms of capacity. That means we need to consolidate that into our long-term memory. That takes time, But those are 3 very simple steps you can think of when you're designing your lessons. I have to engage my students, then I can start building new knowledge, then I can help them consolidate. Just remember that consolidation will take time, days, weeks, even months, depending on what you're teaching them. The thing here is, and I'm going to talk to Paul next week. I'm going to record a podcast episode with him, So I don't want to make him angry or anything. He would be very angry if I didn't tell you that. Are those clear stages of your lesson? Are they isolated stages of your lesson? Or do you think you have to keep coming back to different stages depending on what happens? Because normally when we design our lessons based on frameworks that are very popular in ELT, for example, PPP framework, right? Presentation, practice, production. When we have ESA, like engage, study, activate, they kind of, they feel intuitive as well. But those stages, we have to be careful not to assume that this is the engage state and then, it's done. I have to go to the study stage and I cannot go back to engage. No, this framework tells you that you have to keep coming back to those stages whenever needed. So sometimes I engage my students, I start building, it gets overwhelming, I lose their engagement. They lose engagement. They are not paying attention anymore. So I have to engage again, because if they're not paying attention, I cannot build. They cannot create new memory, right? So the idea here is really, engage is about the emotional and cognitive processes that are important when the brain is engaged. So when I want to learn something because it's irresistible, I'm curious about it, I'm engaged. When my teacher calls my name, so cold calling really might work because I raise their level of cortisol just a little bit. Have you ever heard of cortisol, the stress hormone? If there are absolutely no stakes in the class, if I never call anyone to answer anything, why do they have to be alert? They're not. So if I raise their level of cortisol just a little to make sure that they are paying attention, because there are consequences, if they don't know, if they're not paying attention, then they will pay more attention. So I can do that. That's engaging as well. It's not exposing our students as long as you have the right atmosphere, that everybody can learn, everybody can make mistakes, you can do it. Also, building is very important because we need new knowledge to respect the working memory capacity to be learned effectively. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And finally, we need time and application for consolidation to work. Okay, so that takes time. It takes a couple of days even. Okay, that means at the end of the lesson, we usually have self-assessment or a can-do list or something. Now I can do this and this and this. Can you really? Well, now you can, but what about tomorrow? What about next week? Does that mean that you learned? If you can do it now, have you learned? All of you teachers here know really, really well that sometimes you taught something on Monday, your students did well on Monday, but then on Tuesday, they don't even remember you taught them that, right? Because they haven't consolidated that as long-term learning. So we have to keep coming back. We have to revise things, We have to help them learn and also, learn on their own how to study better. The science of learning can do that for us, right? So to summarize this, and then we can talk more about strategies. In other words, first and foremost, get their attention. Secondly, give the instruction. You have to do this, or give the explanation. This is how this works. And finally, execution. Get them to do something, because this is aligned with how the brain works. If you have their attention, then you can start giving the instructions. How many times did you have to repeat your instructions again and again and again because nobody was listening, right? So make sure you get their attention. Then you give the instruction. Then they do something, so that they can better understand and learn from that, right? So let's talk about strategies now. We're coming to the end of the session. And then, of course, we'll have time for some questions. Well, here's a very good strategy. And I'm going to do this with you right now. Pre-testing. What do you think pre-testing is? In just, a couple of words, what is pre-testing? You can use the chat to answer. Aha, Ben said something. Marilyn, yes. Yes, yes. All of you are absolutely right. Testing before teaching, activating prior knowledge, testing their knowledge before task. Very good. And I just did that with you. I just pre-tested you, right? So before telling you what something is, I check if you already know, because this works really well. And here's one thing you can do, and I got this from the teachingenglish.org website, from the British Council, that I think it's an amazing way for you to pre-test. Let's say you're going to teach again some grammar, you're going to revisit some grammar or even vocabulary. This works both ways, right? Have you ever done a grammar auction? Anyone? If you don't know, please check the website later. It's amazing. I've had so much fun doing this with my students, So you can start the lesson with that to see what they already know. You're going to teach this grammar point, this grammar structure. Before you do that, do an auction. So you show some sentences using that grammar. Some will be right, some will be wrong, and then give your students fake money so they can buy the sentences they think are correct. So like an auction, right? And then some of them will buy the wrong sentences and then they lose their money. So this is an amazing game that can be a lot of fun, and it can be very, very good for pre-testing. Okay, so you start the lesson, they buy the sentences, you correct, and then you say, okay, why are these sentences wrong, or why are these ones correct, right? That's one way you can do it. All good so far? Yes. Now, there's another one that I wanted to share here with you. This strategy has a lot to do with cognitive load. So this is something that is very well studied and established, let's say, in the literature, is that we have our capacity in terms of working memory is not that high, so we cannot hold a lot of information in our working memory at the same time. So that means that if I show my students this, so how do you think your students feel at first when they get a handout like this or a worksheet like this with a lot of text? They feel stressed, bored, frustrated. Yes, overwhelmed. Yes. So how do we work with something like this? We pair that with an image. So if you go to where I got this, I got this from Learn English, britishcouncil.org. There's an image that comes with this, but it's not in the handout. It's not inside the handout, right? So what you can do is you can show parts of the handout as you're teaching and pair that with an image to help them do something we know as dual coding. Dual coding has to do with showing images and text when they're doing individual study, okay? But there's a catch here. What is the catch? The catch is, and I am doing it wrong. While I was explaining that, while I was speaking, some of you were actually trying to read that text. Tell me the truth. Confess. Yes or no? Say so in the chat box. Were some of you trying to read that? Yes, because it's irresistible. We want to know what the handout is about. So for those of you who were trying to read the handout while I was speaking, you didn't get what I was speaking because cognitive overload. You have one phonological channel in your working memory. So when you're trying to read something and somebody's talking over that, you cannot pay attention. Your attention is divided. So you don't learn very well. So here's a very, very good tip that it's very simple, but it avoids cognitive overload. Whenever you are speaking, remove all text from your lesson, from your presentations, from your slide, hopefully even from the classroom. If you have a lot of posters in the classroom with a lot of text, that's bad. I'm sorry to tell you, because students get distracted. They divide their attention. Yeah. Now, if you want your students to read the text, as I did with the definition of science of learning, what did I do? Did I read with you? Did we read together? Or what did I do? Do you remember? Yes, I let you read because then there's only one voice in your head. Your voice. If you have more than one voice in your head, you should go to a psychiatrist maybe or a psychologist, But that voice in your head is your own voice reading. If I am reading with you or if I'm reading for you and you're trying to read, that's bad. Cognitive overload. Too much information going on, right? So you have to read yourselves. So if I am explaining something and speaking, remove all text. If you want to read, remove all speech. If your students will read, remove all speech. Make sure that they are paying attention. Again, attention is that expensive commodity that we have to focus on, right? And then here's something interesting. When I was studying geography in secondary school here in Brazil, my teacher, his name was Odival. So hello, Odival. I have no idea where you are. He was going to teach a lesson about the layers of planet Earth, So he was going to talk about the nucleus, the mantle and the crust, the magma and all of that. And I still remember that because he brought an avocado. He actually brought a real avocado to our lesson, right? And you know what? That looks exactly like planet Earth. We had fancy books, we had amazing materials, but I still remember this lesson from many years ago, more than 2 decades ago, because of the avocado. Okay? So he used a concrete example of something that I already know. I like avocados. I eat avocados. I like them. And he attached this new information, the layers of Earth, to this neuronal network that I already had. And yes, somebody mentioned it, realia. So you can use real objects to teach and reduce, optimize cognitive load for your students. You know, sometimes we work really hard to make very fancy slides and everything, right? We want our slides to look beautiful, amazing, but this works better usually. That's why do you think, did I do it with you or not today? Yes or no? Why do I think, why do you think I stopped sharing my slide to show you my brain, huh? Because this is going to make it more memorable. I can show you a beautiful, fancy picture of a brain, but if I show you a real thing, but you know, if we were together and I actually allowed you to touch this brain, it would be much better, right? Does that make sense? And finally, do you want to see the last one? Last strategy? Yes? Yes or no? Can I go home? I am home actually. I'm connecting from home. So the last one here is, this is very important, folks, retrieving and spacing. And I'll give you an example here. Let's imagine that your students are working with this. You know, I got this from Learn English Kids, britishcouncil.org, and they're talking about languages, okay? Languages. And you do that in lesson 1, let's say. What should you do next? Once you've taught this, you have to ask them questions to see what they can remember, okay? And you can, so you can assign, I got this from the website, this writing here. Which languages do you speak? Which languages do you can assign this as homework or extension or whatever you call, but don't allow your students to write down the answers there. If you print this out and they put the answers right there, every time they go back to this resource, the answers will be there. So they will not be retrieving, they will be reading. And that means they will not be activating their memory. So one way you can do, one thing you can do that is really simple for you to help your students retrieve in space is every so often after lesson 1 or 2, you do a revision. And you use your own book, your own materials, but make sure that the answers are not written there, but in a separate notebook, because then the questions will be there blank, and then the students will be able to read the questions and try to answer on their own. Does that make sense? So that means they will be retrieving information. This is one of the best strategies based on the science of learning. It's called retrieval practice. And that means that your students will actually make a conscious effort to try and actually get the answers from their long-term memory and not just read what they wrote. Because sometimes they don't remember, but then they see the answer, they go, yeah, I remember, but they don't remember. They just get a sense of familiarity, like, oh, I did this. It doesn't mean that they have actually consolidated the semantic knowledge, the concept into their working, into their long-term memory. Many times your students challenge you and they say, hey, I know that, Mr., Mrs., right? I know this already. You taught this. And then you say, okay, close your books and tell me then. Do you? Do you really know? That's retrieving, you know? And then they go like, oh, yeah, I don't know. I thought I knew, because those are different memory systems, you know, familiarity and recall, retrieving information. They're different systems. And then you might think you know, but you don't actually know. So those were the 4 strategies that I wanted to share with you based on the science of learning. And here are the references that I've used. Now you can see the full name of all of the researchers. So Jared Cooney Horvath, Todd Rose, and Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa, in case you were wondering, right? And please make sure you visit those resources. They're excellent. Get more familiar, more acquainted with the mind-brain education science and the science of learning, especially. And you know what? I should probably walk the talk before questions. Why don't we do some retrieval practice right now? So retrieval practice basically means, what can you remember from this session now? Can you please share in the chat? If anything comes to mind, share now, okay? And while you're sharing, I'm ready for questions, all right? Let's see. And of course, if you want to follow my work, please do so. I'm all over social media. I have a new brand called The Learning Cosmos. I have a website, and I also have a blog, and I talk about all of those things. So it's called The Learning Cosmos blog on Substack. Okay, so you can follow me there as well. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you so much, Andre. We have some retrieval practice going on because, yeah, I see
Yes, I can see
answers.
that. Amazing. That's great.
It's good. Yeah, I mean, I think that we've got teachers here who are really great students because when you ask those questions,
Yeah.
do you remember the name of the researcher? Do you remember what was in the bottom corner? I'll be honest and tell you that I didn't, and I've seen your slides before.
Exactly.
So
See, it takes time, but it was my mistake. Okay, Melissa, I didn't tell you to pay attention. If I had
yeah.
told you to pay attention, you would probably remember now. Yeah.
But I was super impressed with ever the attention that people in the audience take. So
Yes.
that was
Yeah.
great. So yeah, keep the answers coming in and ask some questions as well. Anything you
Yeah.
want to know, anything that you want Andre to talk more about, he's really happy to answer your questions. I really enjoyed that. That was great. I'll read a couple of
Excellent.
comments that I like.
Yeah. Okay.
Argenis says that Argenis can remember the realia. Um,
Yes.
and that's something, yeah, that's going
Yes.
to stick with Argenis. And someone, Soha, says they're going to think about learning in the medieval age versus now. So that's
Uh-huh.
that's a
Okay.
question that's stuck with people. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Mirese says first attention, then instruction. Definitely, that's their
That's it.
take home.
Excellent.
A great one.
Wonderful.
I've got a lovely question from Eva,
Okay.
and Eva asks, can you share anything from your own learning experiences of languages? Have
Yeah.
these things helped you learn?
Yes. So I'll share something that is very intuitive. I think it's usually taken for granted, and people don't value as much as they should. But it's the idea of having a brain break. You know,
Okay.
I think, and there's a lot of research about how we change from a focused mode of thinking and learning to a diffuse mode of thinking and learning when we start making deeper connections
Uh-huh.
or when we start consolidating whatever is in our working memory, which is here. And we can see from
Mm-hmm.
neuroimaging studies that when we're focused, this is really activated, the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe. When we are relaxing, when we don't think about that, we get into something called the default mode network. And then we can see
Mm-hmm.
more activation here in the back, or the other
Okay.
lobes of the brain. That means we are sending that information via the hippocampus to other parts of the brain. And that can only happen if you stop doing whatever you're
Okay.
doing. That can only happen if you relax. What happens
Uh-huh.
today that is really concerning is that we are never relaxing because we're
Mm-hmm.
always in front of a screen. We're always,
Mm-hmm.
we're doom scrolling, we're like zombies
Mm-hmm.
just scrolling, looking for something else and that's
Mm-hmm.
bad. Whenever you learn something, whenever you are exposed to new information, after a
Mm-hmm.
couple of minutes, just go get some tea, pet
Mm-hmm.
your cat, water the plants, walk around the apartment, go for a walk in the park with
Mm-hmm.
no phones, please, no phones. Just, relax your brain so you
Yeah.
can start making those connections. And that's one thing we should do more often. So, the
Yeah.
Pomodoro technique comes to mind here.
Oh,
You can
I've
you can
heard
try
of
that.
that. So that's like
Yeah.
10 minutes, something like that of studying.
Yeah. Originally, it was 25 minutes of focus study, and then you take
25.
a
Okay.
5 minute break and then 25-minute block again.
Okay.
But it depends on how comfortable you feel like, okay, this is not working. So study for 10
Hmm.
minutes, but then you can
Uh-huh.
go a little bit longer later. But it's
Hmm.
kind of aligned with what we know about how long the working memory lasts. We
Hmm.
know that it
Hmm.
lasts around 15 to 20 minutes. There's research from
Hmm.
the 1960s showing that if you have a problem with your hippocampus, if they were removed, for example, after
Hmm.
15 minutes or 20 minutes, you forget all the information you were exposed to.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that should be your window. Use those 15, 20 minutes or a little bit more and
Uh-huh.
then take a break and then go back to studying. Yeah,
Uh-huh. So that's really about changing up activities in the classroom, stand up,
exactly.
move partners, just all these little things to kind of
Yeah.
refresh and reset. And also the reason why probably I have the best ideas for my classes when I'm in the shower or walking my dogs and things like
Exactly.
that as
Because you're
well.
making those deeper connections, right?
Hmm.
Salvador Dali used to do, according to his biography, when he got stuck painting something new, he would take a nap
Hmm.
in his favorite
Okay.
armchair. And apparently he had a key chain or something that he was holding. And then once he fell asleep, he would drop the keychain and the noise would wake him up and he would know what to do next. So because he
Wow.
made those deeper connections. Yeah.
But not something to do in the classroom, right?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure you can allow your kids to take a nap, but very patterns of
Yeah.
interaction, change
Yeah.
tasks. This will help them. Yeah.
Oh, it's really great advice, really great advice. We don't have any more time for questions today, but everyone, don't worry. We have invited Andre back to answer,
Yeah.
sorry, more of your questions. He's going to be live on Facebook in a couple of weeks. He'll be back with our other presenter, Georgia. So send in your questions, we'll store them, and we will have another chance to ask him. We're going to finish now. Thanks, Andre, for everything today. Thanks for your patience at the start. We got the technical problem sorted out. And yeah, we're looking forward to meeting and working with you again.
Definitely. And for those who want to follow my work, my website is there. Okay. So thank you so much,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you. We'll see you in about 15 minutes for our final webinar of today. And we're going to address this emotional side of learning. So come back soon. Take care, everyone. Goodbye for now. Bye.